Welcome to the Top 12 Highlights from Chapter 1. I'm Mr. Rodman taking you through it. Please keep in mind this does not replace you reading the textbook. This does not replace you going through teacher notes. This does not replace you looking at the overall chapter notes. This is just a highlight so you can hit the most important things in this chapter and then delve deeper if you need to, but really just seeing what is most important from Chapter 1 on constitutional democracy. Thanks for joining me. First of all, what does it mean? Well, it's the idea that we have a government that is basically ruling by a set of documents, by a constitution. And this constitution basically is our governing way to hold the power in the hands of the people. We hold free and fair elections in order to allow people to raise their voices and make their voices heard. This is the direct democracy piece in terms of voting in primaries and that sort of thing for their House and Senate leaders. Then we have a representative democracy in terms of having those leaders represent us in a republic, taking the issues that are most important to their voters to the halls of Congress and getting laws made or changed that address those issues. Power is fragmented. This is the pluralist theory, the idea of pluralist democracy. You're basically cutting up into national, state, and local governments, and then within that, within the branches, think Montesquieu here in terms of a legislative branch that makes the laws, an executive branch that carries out the laws, and a judicial branch that interprets those laws. So power is very fragmented, and it isn't perfect. This is not a perfect system. Democracies take work. Democracies are messy. But the idea is the people are committed to staying informed, staying educated, and staying active in terms of making that happen. And you need all of those things in order for a constitutional democracy to work. So the direct democracy we talked about, the idea where people vote on everything, people vote on all things, and we have some examples of that in terms of a pure democracy or direct democracy. The direct primary, where you basically are electing or selecting the leaders who will run in the general election from your party. We have petitions or the initiative process where you sign it outside of a supermarket or somebody comes to your door and asks for you to sign a petition. That then moves to referendum. It gets on the ballot and people vote on those referenda on election day as part of their ballot. And then we have recall, in which you can basically say, hey, we don't want that leader. They've gone against what we wanted them to do. So we're going to recall our vote and vote for somebody else. And we talked about in California where they were successful in doing that to the governor, and in Wisconsin where they were not successful in issuing that recall to the governor. So 3 types of representative democracy. Again, we've looked at the participatory aspect of people directly participating, becoming informed voters, being educated, and then taking action based on that, and continuing to vote as well as stay active in other areas, maybe join interest groups, join political parties, join campaigns, contribute to those different types of groups, and really staying active in that direct participation. But also the pluralist aspect in terms of different groups that organize in a way that try and impact the national, state, and local levels of government, as well as the branches, the legislative branch in asking our leaders to do certain things, and in the executive branch in asking the president and different agencies or departments to do certain things, and then in the judicial branch in terms of holding them accountable for what they are interpreting in terms of the laws. And then we have the elitist theory of influence, which is this idea of elite democracy, in which people, the wealthy and overeducated or the highly educated, end up having more say and more power in the democracy because of either their wealth, they have more money and they can exert that influence, or they have more information. They're more educated than others and they can use that to influence policymaking as well. So all 3 of these we see in terms of the models of representative democracy, and we see those throughout today in varying levels and degrees of participation. Other forms of government that we see, the autocracy, the rule of one. Think of the Kim Jong-un in North Korea. We have the oligarchy. Think of it as the Central Committee in China. And then we have democracy, very much like our own. And there are other forms of democracy as well that are more central in nature, such as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland would be democracy, but structured very differently in that they have a stronger central government and less state governments But that is still democracy. People are voting in elections and electing those individuals. We also have the monarchies. We have the absolute monarchy, the idea that the king or queen is in control and basically has total rule. We see in Great Britain it's more of a constitutional monarchy. The monarchy there is more of a figurehead role. It's ceremonial, not necessarily a whole lot of legislative or governmental action that can be taken there. And then we have the totalitarian dictatorship, much like the autocracy we talked about before, in terms of one leader basically exerting a significant amount of control over the government and over those governmental workers and in carrying that out. Now, what values interact in terms of our democracy? We heard Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. The personal liberty, really important. And we saw this with the anti-federalists, the Sam Adams, the George Masons, the Patrick Henrys of the world, all looking at personal liberty and individualism as very important, enough to be protected through a Bill of Rights. The aspect of equal opportunity also being very important to them in terms of making voices heard and making sure that there was an equity of voices in terms of having a level playing field in approaching your leaders. And then lastly, popular sovereignty, the will of the people, being able to vote and exercise your voice in a way that can show the will of the people in terms of what is out there. And that is so important to the political debate that we continue to see in our constitutional democracy today. What processes then really play out with that type of democracy? Well, we need to have free and fair elections. Everybody needs to have the right to vote and to be able to access the vote in order to do that. We have majority and plurality rule, the idea of the majority speaking and having a voice. This is where we hear a lot about the Electoral College not necessarily agreeing and siding with the majority in terms of an election in which the Electoral College is different than the majority vote, the popular vote. Hillary Clinton was elected through the popular vote, but the Electoral College is the one that counts, and Donald Trump won the Electoral College. So again, it stifles that majority rule, and so that is of concern. We hear people calling for the abolishment of the Electoral College. An article in the New York Times today actually calling for that, and a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the varying aspects of debate when it comes to the Electoral College. And we'll talk more about that in Unit 2, but the idea here is you want to have majority voices being heard and feeling like their free and fair elections actually count for something, which is really important here. You also want them to be able to express themselves freely and to be able to use your freedom of speech and your ability to petition your government, to assemble with others and protest and petition for a redress of grievances under the First Amendment. All of these relate to our democracy because they allow us to speak out, to be educated and informed, but also to speak our voices in terms of what we care about and what we hold dear. Now, some structures in place to really help the values that we hold dear in terms of that interaction. We see federalism, the sharing of power between state and national government. We see a separation of powers, individual branches having their own roles and responsibilities. We also see bicameralism, cooling off the tensions of the tyranny of the majority or the whims of the masses, cooling it off so that whatever is passed as a law is a cautious and deliberate measure and not just thrown out there in terms of doing what the people want, but making sure that it stands the test of time, that it withstands a constitutional scrutiny by the Supreme Court and by the courts. That's the importance of that bicameralism is to have serve as a check on each other in terms of the branches to make sure that the laws and legislation that is passed is good legislation, good for the people, good for the democracy, good for the Constitution. And then we have checks and balances to kind of negate, and we'll talk more about that in Chapter 2, but to keep those branches of government in check to make sure that they don't become more powerful than other branches. The question always asked of people is, which branch is most important? Well, again, that's a value judgment, but in terms of the eyes of the Constitution, they're all equal. They're co-equal branches, which is why we have checks and balances on all three of them. It's not that the judicial branch is any more or less powerful than the executive or legislative branches. It's that they are co-equal branches and separate roles and responsibilities in government to carry out. And those checks and balances help keep them in check in terms of making that happen when it works, when that works correctly. And we see sometimes where that doesn't work and is cause for concern, and that does lead to people calling for legislation or other aspects of putting more checks in place or checks and balances in place to correct that. And then the last one we have, probably the most important, is the Bill of Rights. And that's the idea of really what the anti-federalists had in mind, this idea of outlining what is most important for the individuals that are seeking that redress of grievances. They're seeking to make their voices heard. How do we protect those rights? And they're enshrined in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. That Bill of Rights, so important to those individual aspects. And we see time and again where that was such a critical role that the anti-federalists played in getting the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. Now, let's go back for a second to where do all these rights come from? Well, they don't come from government. They come from a higher power. They come from natural rights, those that are given to us by a higher power, a higher law. Back in this time where there were deists, people believed in one God, so to speak. And so they looked at that as a power not given by government, but by that higher power, by that supreme being. And it was something that government couldn't take away unless we let them. And that was really important because that's really the driver of many of the philosophers and the philosophies of the time. The idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or this property that Jefferson would talk about in the Declaration of Independence, was really important here because it focused on the idea that government didn't give us life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It was natural law that gave us the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Man basically instituted government to protect us from other human beings that weren't quite so nice and weren't following common order and the maintenance of order and social law at the time. So that was really important for them. Hobbes said at this time it's survival of the fittest, and we have men that are killing each other over mundane things. And why is life so nasty? Why is man so brutal to each other? And so we need a government in order to keep that peace. And that was really the important aspect of Hobbes, is really showing how important that really was. And then Locke came along and said, it's not just about keeping the peace. We need government to basically establish a social contract, some type of order, and with the humans, so that we still maintain our rights, but we give up some of those rights in order to have this peace and order and this state of nature that we want, so we can have a more civil society. And then Montesquieu said, but there are ways in this social contract that we can actually we can divide the government up so it becomes less powerful and doesn't become this usurping authority over the voters, over the citizens. And so let's divide up the government into pieces. Let's divide up into a legislative branch that makes the laws, and an executive branch that that enforces the laws, and a judicial branch that interprets those laws. And so Montesquieu's idea of separation of powers is what Madison would use in creating Article 1, the legislative branch, and Article 2, the executive branch, and Article 3, the judicial branch. All of these coming from Montesquieu, a very important role in terms of separating the government so it can't become too powerful. And we see that today in terms of what is broken out. Those are really the writings of Montesquieu that Madison used and drew on in terms of writing the Constitution in a way that would really limit the powers and roles and responsibilities of government. And then Rousseau came along and said, okay, John Locke said we have a social contract, and Montesquieu said we're going to divide up the government in terms of roles and responsibilities. But it's most important that we also note that if government breaks their agreement and doesn't do what they say they're going to do in terms of helping the citizens in maintaining order and the social order of things, that we can break that contract, that we can break the contract and then form a new government. And in many cases in a democracy, we can vote them out and we can elect a new government. Now, well, the French kind of took that to an extreme in the French Revolution, looked at it and said, we need to start over. We need to go out and get rid of the king and queen and start over with something completely different. But Rousseau's writing here is so important because this is what democracy is all about: is the idea of, if you don't like what the people that you've elected are doing in government, you can vote them out, you can get rid of them, and you can replace them with a new government. And so never is this more evident than in Shay's Rebellion, when you have a recession that hits farmers really badly and they can't afford to pay their mortgages. So banks start to foreclose, and farmers get angry. They get mad because the government's not doing anything to help them. The government, the national government, can't because it has no money under the Articles of Confederation. It can't tax anyone, and it can't pay for an army. If you can't tax anyone, you're at the behest of states basically giving you handouts. And so Shay's Rebellion really put on the map the concerns about no strong central government being in place to put down a rebellion. And in the back of the founders and framers' minds is the idea of slavery. If Shay's Rebellion is going to cause this strife that it's going to be hard for the government to put down, what is the issue of slavery when it finally does become the central issue that we need to be talking about, and it starts to split the country apart, as it already did in trying to get the Constitution ratified? How are you ever going to make this happen? And so the idea here is you need a stronger central government. And so that's when the delegates were called to the convention in Philadelphia to basically amend the Articles of Confederation. And that was their stated purpose. The idea here was to fix the Articles. It wasn't to throw it out and start with a new constitution. They really wanted to fix the Articles of Confederation. But what they found was, as we got into this, we basically established a government under the Articles that isn't going to work. It's not going to be strong enough. The central government is not going to be powerful to do anything, let alone put down a rebellion. And then we have unanimity. For one example, we have no executive. We don't have any interpretation of the courts. We don't have any way to tax individuals, and we can't form an army because we can't tax anybody. So we can't put down any rebellions. This is going to be a problem. So what they found was we have to throw it out. We have to start over, and that's essentially where they came up with the idea of, hey, unanimity isn't going to work. We need 9 of 13 colonies to sign on board. We're going to have to compromise in order to get things done. And so that means we're going to have to give up some things in order to get some things in return. And compromise wasn't always a dirty word. The idea is that they knew in order to get things done, they were going to have to give a little to get a little. And this is the art of the possible. The idea behind large states and small states agreeing on compromises in order to find a way to create a better government. And so this is where we see the New Jersey plan, then in the Virginia plan, and the 3/5 compromise, and the Connecticut compromise, in terms of trying to really carry this out and get things done. So we see a lot of principles here that are a result of these compromises. We see those ideas of federalism and separation of powers, checks and balances, rule of law, the idea no one is above the law. There is no King George anymore. Everybody must follow the law and follow the letter of the law. So some compromises that did take shape. The Senate was not where people were electing their representatives. It really was through the state legislatures that made this happen. The president wasn't elected by the people. It was through the Electoral College that this happened. And Article 2 outlined the Electoral College aspects. We have judicial review under Article 3. This idea of checking and balancing by determining whether laws are constitutional are unconstitutional. And then how difficult it was to pass legislation in a bicameral legislature when you're trying to cool off the tensions but pass good legislation that is cautious and deliberative. So we see a lot of these aspects of compromise in terms of coming out of the Constitution that is really so important here and really at play. And really the roles that it plays here are so important. We move on to one of the biggest problems that Madison had was really this balance. How do we create a government that is powerful enough to put down a rebellion, but not so powerful that it goes against what the people really wanted government for in the first place, which was to let us be, to just let us be what we want to be. And so that was really his problem, was really trying to balance the needs and interests of people that wanted their individual rights and states that wanted their individual rights to govern themselves. Virginians wanted to govern Virginians, and And, those in Massachusetts wanted to govern in Massachusetts, and those in New York the same. So this is where we get to the anti-federalist concerns, that Madison had a concern that the government didn't want the government to be too strong. Well, anti-federalists also had that concern, but in a different aspect. They were worried that it would be so strong that it would restrict states' rights and would restrict the individuals in those states. And so they wanted, they were Virginians, and they were the Carolinians, and they were individuals that were really concerned about and had a lot more, at the time, interest in what was going on in local politics, local being in their states. So it was really hard for them to see why a central government was so important, other than to put down a rebellion or to fight an army against a foreign power. And so this is where, again, you see the idea of compromise. Madison sits down and says, George Mason, Patrick Henry, let's look at this and try and figure out a way that we can create a government that isn't so powerful, but is powerful enough to put down these things that we're concerned about. And the Anti-Federalists kept coming back to the idea of a Bill of Rights. We've got to have a Bill of Rights in there. We've got to address what individuals are entitled to. And Madison was looking at it from the perspective, well, we didn't really need that because we've enumerated the power that the national government has, and they only have that power. But what he didn't see was the issue of kind of reading between the lines and stretching things to mean, in terms of interpretation, stretching things to mean other rights and privileges that the national government would take over the 200 plus years that we've had them. And so that was the concern Anti-Federalists had. And so it was a really good foreshadowing of including those Bill of Rights. And so it was actually when the Anti-Federalists decided, why don't we just call for another convention and we'll fix this? And Madison's like, no, I know what happened the last time we created it. We called for a convention. We ended up throwing it out and starting over, and we don't want to do that. So I'll agree, if you can help us ratify this Constitution, we will include a Bill of Rights, and we will take up those 12 amendments. It would ultimately be 10. But we'll take up those amendments, and I will help you fight for them. And he did, and helped get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. As a result of that, we have the Bill of Rights today. But it's important to note some specific rights that were included in the Constitution outside of the Bill of Rights that were actually in the Constitution. Things like writ of habeas corpus. I can't be charged with a crime without knowing what it is that I'm being charged with. Okay, and this is outside of a rebellion or civil war. Lincoln would suspend habeas corpus when 9/11 hit. The war on terror, President Bush suspended that habeas corpus, and the reasons for that really. Because otherwise you want to know what you're being charged with. You want to know, what are the crimes against you? Bill of Attainder, you can't take groups of people and just say, hey, everybody, we're creating a law against you. This Bill of Attainder is no good. It would be unconstitutional. Ex post facto laws. Everybody who wore a blue shirt today is going to, you obviously didn't know that when the law was created. You already had a blue shirt on. So you can't go after the fact and pass laws that will impugn people. That's not helping either. Trial by jury in criminal cases is outlined in the Constitution, as well as privileges and immunities, making sure that states are honoring each other's immunities and privileges. There's no religious test to serve in office in the United States government. There's no religious test to pass there. They really wanted religion to be separate from service to the nation. And then protecting contracts, the order of business, again, to maintain that social order, maintain commerce at that particular time. That was really a role that they found was really important. So these were rights that were included in the original Constitution before the Bill of Rights was even added. So you can see Madison really was trying to integrate a lot of the aspects of individual rights even before the Bill of Rights came along. But obviously he agreed ultimately with the George Masons and Patrick Henrys of the world that more would need to be done, and a Bill of Rights was a good compromise to make that happen. I hope you found this helpful. This is the top 12 highlights of Chapter 1. Good luck on the quiz or test coming up, and we will see you in Chapter 2.